everyone. This is Jill Hurston. I'm the Marketing Director at Accelerate. Welcome to today's webinar on AWS migration and modernization approaches. With that being said, I'm going to introduce Mike Watson. He is our VP of Engineering at Accelerate. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jill, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to talk about lift and shift cloud migrations in general, and specifically around AWS and how you can do it with them. I know that most people already have tried some lift and shift or tried some migration, but one of the things that's interesting to me is that, just lifting and shifting may not be enough for most people, and it doesn't give you the maximum benefits. So hopefully at the end of this webinar, you'll see how there's other strategies and how lift and shift might just be the first step. So with that, I'm going to bring in our panelists, or actually our presenters today. I've got Hamdi Eid. He's the Senior Solutions Architect for Serverless. Welcome, Hamdi. And then I also have Giovanni Gravesand. He's a Partner Solutions Architect in charge of migrations. It's great to have you guys on board, and I'm going to go ahead and let Giovanni take it away.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mike. Just to kind of introduce myself a little further as well. So I am a partner migration solutions architect. I am based out of New York City. Spent quite a bit of time in the New York City financial services sector. Been with AWS now for 1.5 years. And as Mike had stated, been working with a lot of our customers and partners on some of their migration initiatives, lift and shift, modernization, etc. So really appreciate everyone's attendance and participation today. We have some business and technical content for you. So kind of thanks for spending time with us today. Enjoy. Thanks.
Yes, so my name is Hamdi Eid. I'm a senior solution architect with AWS as well. I specialize in serverless technology, and I've been with AWS for almost 2 years now. I have a background in workflows and business process management application, as well as modernization. So thank you very much for being here today, and look forward to it.
Yeah, so just real quick, we're going to go off camera for the rest of this. We just want to make sure everyone got to see our live smiley faces. And we'll just I'll quickly run through the agenda. So like I mentioned, we're going to talk about the migration and modernization journey, get into some cloud native solutions, specifically with serverless, and also talk about some best practice. And ultimately, what we'd love to have happen is a discussion between you, the audience, and us. So Q&A at the end. So please submit your questions via the GoToWebinar tool, and we'd be happy to pick a few of those and talk through those. All right, Giovanni.
All right, thank you. All right. So I think this is a good place to start for everyone to kind of really conceptualize the migration and modernization journey end to end. So this could be a refresher for some of you, so apologize if so, but just to kind of introduce this 3-phase migration framework that we sort of evangelize here at AWS of assess, mobilize, and migrate and modernize, okay? And so they've got sort of defined gates in between each of these phases, and we find that it's been very effective for customer adoption of cloud services, right? So in this assessment phase that we kick off with, the goal here is really to make it very easy to kind of assess and make decisions quickly. And we can kind of do a lot of assessments. We can kind of compress that timeline as well and get some assessments done in days and weeks. In the past, it used to be months, actually. And so that time compression, we've been able to achieve that basically using a number of experiential accelerators and using a lot of mature just tools on the market as well. We have our own, and there's some also in the AWS marketplace that helps us in terms of that. And so in that assess phase, we kind of get to the point where we get a TCO. We have some sort of a TCO report, kind of a do nothing versus do something analysis, right? And then also a crucial component here is a migration readiness assessment. So here we're kind of looking at an organizational view of cloud readiness. So this is not just your technical sort of capability, but also let's take a look at the governance. Let's take a look at, sort of vendor relationships, operational complexities, those sorts of things. And so at the end of assess, we make sure we don't actually move forward until there's an executive commitment to move forward. right? And so we need some sort of a directional business case at the end of a SaaS. And then we get to the mobilize phase, which is basically another word for readiness, okay? And the key here is really we're looking to kind of develop cloud capabilities. This is really a foundational phase. And this is not just for Greenfield either, okay? So we found many customers already have adopted a number of cloud services, and we still kind of need to revisit mobilize for some of them as well. And then finally into the migrate and modernize phase. And the gate to get here really is that you've developed some sort of a migration factory. So that's kind of using a number of processes, tools, your governance is in place, and we've gotten to a point where we can kind of move applications in batches or sort of waves, if you will. And now we're operating on the cloud, and we are looking to kind of continually improve here. So we don't really stop once we've moved, and that's kind of a key part of the framework. And that brings you into kind of the modernization motions. And so we can kind of do some modernization on the way in, right? As we migrate. So we can multitask sometimes in that sense, but we do kind of find that sort of large scale data center exits, we find it's more effective to kind of modernize after the migration is sort of complete. All right, so to kind of continue along that that topic of migrate and modernize and the semantics behind that. So it's a bit of a continuum when we talk about that. So we kind of start with that lift and shift, right? That's the starter pack for cloud adoption. We can get around 10% ROI just doing a little bit of hardware and software right sizing. Okay, so that's, for example, let's take a look at your SQL licensing, for example. We'll do a license assessment. We'll figure out we can kind of downsize from SQL Enterprise to standard, and we can kind of replace some of those enterprise features with AWS functionality, and we can kind of save like 10% there. As we kind of move across this continuum now, you can see you start to adopt more SaaS solutions, more open source solutions, and our unit economics are really starting to improve here now. Okay, and then really when we get down into the managed services and containers and serverless areas, we're really starting to bend the curve here now, right? And so we're getting closer to maximizing our innovation velocity at this point. And finally, if you get to complete cloud native architectures, that's where we have the lowest cost of compute and storage options there. So the next logical question then is, all right, well, how do I determine that pathway? Okay, so the first real step is you have to kind of take a deep dive into your complete application portfolio. You got to look at everything. And so what we've done is we've looked at thousands of migrations, and we've kind of picked out the patterns that have emerged from that. And that is specific to enterprise IT portfolios as well, as a little bit of a disclaimer there. So first thing is we can see that around 10 to 20% of that portfolio can be either retired or kind of repurchased into some sort of a SaaS solution. So that's kind of reducing the size of your estate totally. So less work for your IT managed estate, basically. And then move to AWS. The kind of topic for today is like the sort of lift and shift, which also includes a little bit of relocate. That's a pattern of just kind of using the VMware cloud option, for example. So what we see in enterprise portfolios is around 60% will kind of be a good fit for sort of that pattern. So here, it's minimal architectural changes we've done. We might have done a little light operating system or database changes, just a little bit. Maybe we've added some HA services, etc. But overall, architecturally, I haven't made much material changes. And then finally, actually looking to modernize and transforming on AWS. We look at the replatform and refactor patterns of adoption. So adopting serverless, containers, and microservices. And this will see about 20% of the portfolio will be good candidates for that. But the main idea, though, is this is the applications that are really your differentiators. The revenue generators, those sorts of applications is really where you want to kind of take those considerations for fully transforming.
So I have a quick question, still kind of on that last slide. So is
Yeah.
there a time where a CTO or a CIO will know that they can't just lift and shift? Is that something that you have to discover through your the assessment process, or is there some obvious use cases where you need to just skip that and go directly to some kind of refactoring or replatforming?
Yeah, good question. There are definitely some obvious patterns that we have to kind of look lift and shift only. Like let's say you've got SAP workloads; those are pretty much going to be lift and shift. But you know,
Hmm.
holistically, we kind of look at it from the perspective is we need to look at the compelling events that's perhaps happening. And when we're doing the application assessment, what we're listening for is some keywords. So if I hear anything about agility, if I hear anything about time to market, I want to go from 4 release cycles to, a multi release cycles per month. So these are sort of the trigger words that I'm thinking about for modernization. For lift and shift, if I hear, the application has a low rate of change, I'm just looking to jumpstart my cloud adoption. I'm looking to do cost reduction really is my main sort of driver, then I'm probably going to kind of look to do lift and shift first. So that's kind of a little bit of the kind of conversation behind that.
Gotcha.
Um,
Thanks for that answer.
yeah, Mike, if I may, let me add a little bit also
Yep.
some color here, if I may. So everything Giovanni said is correct, but also from a modernization, when I look at the modernization possibility or potential project, you need to look at, how is the application looking at aligns directly with your business goals, right? So if you're looking at, for example, high performance or long-term cost, that to be for me would be a trigger for a modernization project, because lift and shift tend to save costs upfront, but not long term, not necessarily long term. Also, when you have team members, for example, that have very good skills in containers or serverless technology or microservices, that's also another factor that I would be listening to when we talk about when do you really make sense to move straight to modernizations.
Yeah, Hamdi, thanks for that. I fully agree, and you're actually helping me out here because this is kind of the segue to this slide here that's been up. It's to fully answer that question also, you've got to basically think about your operating model, and that's going to affect my migration pathway as well. So Hamdi, what you're talking about really is like your workloads that you're thinking about are my grow workloads basically. Maybe I want to move something from local to regional. Maybe I'm going from regional to global. My real differentiators again, that's where I'm really going to want to kind of think about modernization out of the gate. So I'm going to take a refactor or replatform approach for that. Most likely I'm going to have product teams here, and I'm going to kind of fully adopt some sort of a DevOps model as well, right? And the other ops models here as well, it's, they're totally applicable depending on the portfolio and depending on sort of the need. So if I've got kind of minimal investment sort of workloads, and again, I just want to keep the lights on maybe. These are the things that I think are, have rehosts kind of written all over them, all over, right? So they're also pretty good candidates for moving to managed services as well, we find. And then sort of optimized workloads is kind of like in between, maybe Goldilocks is where we're kind of adopting some sort of cloud ops model. I've got a cloud platform team, I've got a DevOps team, but I've moved away from what we have today in traditional ops, which is I'm passing tickets between teams, and it's taking me a very long time for my developers to get their hands on compute and storage that they need to kind of deliver those ideas. So when we get to the optimized stage, we see a lot more replatforming and some repurchasing as well. So the overall idea here is to understand though that depending on what I want to do with my workload, it's going to kind of drive a little bit of my operating model behind that. All right, so keep refactor and replatform in mind because that's going to bring me to the next one here. All right, so I want to take it one step further though in terms of modernization and help Hamdi out as he presents a little bit later. All right, so there are 5 subpathways of modernization of that refactor and replatform, and we kind of break it down to this level here. So you can move to containers, you can kind of move to open source. License freedom is a good driver behind that, maybe moving from .NET Framework to a .NET Core, and then also moving to kind of managed options, managed database, managed analytics. This would be databases, data lakes on the cloud, data warehouses on the cloud. And then kind of thinking back to that continuum that I, a few slides back, where we talked about when do I get my full velocity, where I'm bending that curve. My full modernization realization is when I get to that cloud native sort of architecture. That's where we get a chance to kind of decompose applications. We're using microservices. We're using techniques such as decoupling, those sorts of things, and Hamdi will cover that a little bit for us a little bit later. But the key thing also is the underpinning to all of this at the bottom, you can see there, is a move to modern DevOps. That's the prerequisite pretty much for it all. All right, so what I'd like to do is kind of give you a practical example, sort of a workshop we've done with a customer. Take a look at a legacy architecture they wanted to modernize. So this, by the way, it's a Java WebSphere application using an Oracle commercial database at the back end. And so what I like to kind of do here is just a quick thought experiment with you folks, thinking about the modernization paths here of these 5, and taking a look at this legacy architecture. Anyone want to comment specifically? What do you think would be our first stab at this? Like, where would you start specifically in terms of modernizing this sort of application? Anyone? No wrong answers, by the way.
In absence of the audience being able to directly talk to you, I think probably at the front end, but that's just my guess.
Okay, all right. So I'll walk you through this. Again, there's no wrong answers. You can really take this at a layering approach, and that's how we're gonna kind of talk about it through the rest of this presentation as well. But yeah, the first thing we'll do is we'll kind of try to answer the questions back to the operating model. So what is my challenges? What is my KPIs, and what are the agility targets I'm trying to hit? All right, so once I answer that question, then we can kind of start to do that layering approach that I mentioned. So if I wanted to rehost this now, if I was just doing a straight lift and shift of this legacy architecture, and again, this is Java WebSphere, so it's a licensed product, I would have to go to the marketplace, the AWS marketplace, and kind of grab an image out of there and kind of run it that way as a kind of pure rehost option. Another kind of rehost, or rehost plus, rehost enhanced would be to sort of kind of come off the WebSphere and kind of move to Apache, Tomcat, and I could run that on EC2. But in this case, these are the pathways that we sort of walk the customer through, right? So we kind of dove deep, and we kind of recognized that the workload was not actually specifically critical. You know, it wasn't that business differentiator, so to speak. But at the same time, they really wanted some operational gains out of the migration specifically. And so we were kind of thinking about, okay, what is the sort of minimal viable modernization that we could kind of approach and sort of recommend? And so kind of thinking back to the operating models, this kind of fit to the optimize sort of aspect. So this was the first recommendation, and here we basically just recommended, okay, let's just deploy the existing traditional application, which is a monolith, which we'll discuss later, and let's just take that into a managed container service such as ECS and Fargate. All right, that's just basically repackaging the application, dumping it straight into a container. And then the other layer to that is the managed data aspect. So this is kind of a homogeneous database migration. So we're staying with the Oracle engine here, right? But we're moving into the managed Oracle option on AWS for that layer. And then the underpinning of all of that, again, is the modern DevOps. Okay, so the architecture is pretty much the same. True modernization really didn't occur here. We haven't really opened up the code too much, but the app to container pattern, as you can see at the top, move to containers, it's a jump starting tool for us to kind of move toward cloud native tooling and architecture, right? But in this case, the customer sort of, they had a little bit of objections to this. You know, they thought, you know, am I repackaging the mess that I already have on-prem? You know, does it make sense to go this route? And sort of we thought about it, and you know, we're moving to manage, so we were getting some operational efficiencies out of that. But so we walked them through a couple other options then. So the next option would be like, you know, full max effort, let's go full cloud native. And this is where we would adopt cloud native architecture on the app tier, manage data, license freedom, and obviously the move to DevOps, right? So again, thinking back to the application though, it wasn't really a business differentiator to begin with. So this would have been nice to do. Some time constraints, obviously, and it just didn't make sense overall. So, but something that we kind of presented as what you might do on some other applications that look the same as WebSphere, but have more sort of KPIs behind them. So this is where we really landed with this customer. This is kind of the Goldilocks refactoring that we landed on. So it's still a container-based approach here. So let me just slide back. So the full move to cloud native would have been microservices with serverless. We'd have done some application decomposition. We would have done also data decomposition. We would have looked for opportunities to take some of that relational data models and move them to key value stores, perhaps. That would have been too much work for this application. We still got efficiencies in this way. So moving to microservices with containers and also getting out of the Oracle licensing sort of aspects and moving that to a Postgres open source model was also a definite win for the customer here. So we still did application decomposition. It's WebSphere, if you're not familiar. That's just a way to run a number of Java applications embedded in sort of a centralized server in a way. This was a kind of good middle of the road option for the customer. Kind of the point of all of this was to kind of show you the 5 pathways of modernization and how you might just take it step by step, layer by layer, and kind of walk through and make a decision tree almost out of how you would adopt a modernization path.
So Giovanni, I have a question about that last slide.
Yep.
When they were doing the front end, the non-database part of this, right? So the top 2 boxes, did they move to containers first and then decompose once they were in containers, or did they do this in parallel or a piece at a time?
In this case, we moved the data backend first. So we re-architected that piece to move into the open source Postgres PG SQL option first, as that typically would have been is the most difficult because we have to change the schema and that's probably the biggest lift in this architecture overall. And because it was WebSphere and the business domains within WebSphere was kind of already neatly defined, it was a little bit easier to do the application decomposition in this case.
Okay.
But yeah, great question. Yep. All right, so I'm gonna actually hand it over to you, Mike, but just to kind of wrap up my section here, I just wanted to kind of give you a couple of takeaways to go home with here. The top 3 observations that we've seen from successful enterprises, basically with lift and shift, modernization, the whole gambit. The first thing is, I think I mentioned, you've got to make portfolio and application assessment a priority. You got to do everything up front in that sense. Let's not just look at some applications in a silo and look at how best to kind of migrate those. And you got to look at everything holistically. The second thing is, choosing migration paths based on those operating models I talk about, which is going to be aligned to your business KPIs, your agility targets, etc. And the last thing is, don't boil the ocean either, right? We find that customers can create a lot of momentum when they also augment themselves, right? Use partners, consultants, and please talk to your account team as well with AWS. Yep. So that's really my best advice. Hope you got something out of this one, and thanks for your time. Let me hand it over to you, Mike. I think you've got some customer stories you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, thanks, Giovanni. I think these customer stories dovetail nicely into what you were just talking about. So we got 2 stories that I want to briefly talk about. These are customers where we've worked with AWS, folks like Giovanni, Hamdi, and the customer, has worked with them directly, as well as, we're partnered with them both, from AWS standpoint, but also, from our customer standpoint. And these are really good examples of successful strategies, things that have worked well. And maybe there's some takeaways for everyone in this. So let's start with this Intertech Alchemy case. This is a project pretty near and dear to my heart. I was involved with it from early on in terms of their migration planning. And actually, I got very heavily involved in one of the projects that they built, which I'll talk about in a second. So Alchemy understood the value of moving to a cloud solution, and they were all in with AWS from the beginning. That was they made a choice that we're not going to try some kind of multi-cloud strategy. Let's just buy into AWS and what they have to offer. So their target from the beginning was cloud native, but they had all their infrastructure was in Rackspace, I think, wherever it was. I'm not 100% sure. So it was certainly not in the cloud yet. So they took a couple of strategies. The first thing is they moved what they thought made sense on a lift and shift basis, right? So let's move some of the workload in, knowing that it's not necessarily the best solution, but it got them moving in the right direction. And then what they did is they started carving off new functionality that was part of their existing application and rewriting that in serverless technology, which Hamdi will talk about later. So they went, they basically started creating new chunks of code, and they started leveraging cloud native to do that code. And so that worked out well because they were able to get experience, which is an important thing in doing this type of work. Because if anyone has tried to do serverless, it's for the developers and other people on the team, there's definitely some nuances that have to be learned in order to do it properly. DevOps being one of them, but also just the way a developer works when their compute is not on their machine can be different. So that was very successful. They dovetailed that into a brand new project. So they actually built a new application completely from scratch using React, Node, AWS Lambda, microservices. They wanted to try to use DynamoDB, but the learning curve was too high. And so they reluctantly chose to go with more of a classic Aurora style relational database. The benefits here are listed. They're very happy. They enjoy working with AWS and the architects there, and they'll continue to move down this path and see reap the rewards. So that's it for Intertech Alchemy. The next story is kind of completely different, but also a huge success. So this customer who doesn't want to be named for their own reasons, they started a lift and shift. They took all of their infrastructure and they just moved it over. And then we got engaged with them after that, and they were frustrated because they expected some benefit of this lift and shift, but what it turned out is that the way they're architected, it actually made it more expensive and harder to deal with. So they had to quickly consider other options. And so what they did is they moved to containers, which we talked about in the previous slide, and then started moving to microservices, which we also talked about. So it's very much like that last slide that you had shown, where they moved to containers, and then they started breaking up the application into pieces and allowing those containers to work more in a serverless way, or in more of a pay-as-you-go type of way. And this ultimately helped them with their customers because they had small customers and larger customers, and for each customer they're creating their own tenant, so their own area inside of AWS, and it allowed them to be able to have the same code base support all of these types of tenants regardless, with the right costing structure, which is a huge benefit of serverless. Isn't obvious is that it scales with your workload and your business. So they massively reduced their hosting costs. They were able to build a very clever system that allowed them to deploy a new client in this tenant sort of area within minutes, 50 minutes here in this case, as opposed to what was taking 4 or 5 days for manual or other DevOps kind of scripts to build these environments. So it really is more of a just-in-time environment creation, and that saves their operations and allows them to recognize revenue much quicker. So very much a success story. Again, another happy customer. They also frequently are interacting with AWS directly, with us helping coordinate that. So those are my two stories. Hopefully everyone got the point there. And I think it does, especially the Alchemy story, does set up Hamdi's portion of this.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, Hamdi, let me hand it over here now.
All right, so thank you, Jivan and Mike. So again, my name is Hamdi Eid. I'm a senior solution architect specialized in serverless, and Giovanni did a great job walking you guys through the different options for migrations, and was focused on lift and shift, as well as the modernization paths. There are so many ways you can modernize your application. In this few minutes left, I'm going to be focusing on how to modernize your legacy application using AWS serverless technology specifically. So before we do that, let me set the stage first. And that's defining serverless. Some of you already might know what that is, some might not. But if you ask 10 people in this room today, what is serverless, chances you're gonna get 10 different answers. But at AWS, we define serverless very, very specific, in a very specific way. We have 4 guidelines or 4 tenets, if you will, and all of them have to be present in order for us to consider a service to be serverless or an application to be serverless. And the first tenet is there is no provisioning of the underlying infrastructure, so no management, OS, patching the OS or patching database. Everything is handled by AWS in that respect. The second tenet is automatic scaling. A serverless application or service must be able to respond to workload, meaning a transaction per second or API calls. It should be able to scale up or down as needed. Serverless also means you pay for value. You should never pay for resources that are idle, that you don't use. And you will see that in one of the examples I'm providing later on for Lambda, one of our serverless services. A serverless solution must also meet the tenant of being highly available, highly secure, being able to recover from faults, meaning being fault tolerant and secure. With that definition, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, it's not moving. Let me see. Oh, sorry about that. It's just a delay. Okay, so I'm not sure if you guys heard about the AWS shared responsibility model. It's a shared model which we basically pretty much created what is AWS responsible for and what is the customer, our customers are responsible for. So that responsibility model basically we are responsible for security of the cloud, our infrastructure, our physical infrastructure, data center, storage, compute, and so on. And you are responsible for your security of your application, data movement, and so on. However, that line actually moves up. It goes up when we're talking about serverless as a way of modernizing applications. We take on more responsibility when you use serverless, meaning we do more of the heavy lifting. Pretty much everything you see in that chart, and except there are 2 things that you're responsible for. The first is the business logic of your application, and second, the APIs that you write to communicate between serverless services. This slide is really very important because it just gives you the general way of how would you move from a legacy approach to a legacy thinking, if you will, to quote unquote thinking serverlessly. We have collected a lot of data of our customers over the years, and we came up with those 5 tenets you see here. What does it mean to think serverlessly even before you start modernizing your application? Things you need to start thinking about. The first tenet is features first. What that means is serverless applications tend to be made of a federation of features and functions, and those features and functions correspond or should correspond directly to your business objective or business functions. So try to break down the application to as small as possible features and functions. The second tenet is you focus on events. AWS as a platform is very rich ecosystem of events. Events are extremely important in serverless because they are actually what triggers your serverless workload, right? What gets started is like an example, it could be an HTTP API call, it could be an IoT push button. Those are events happening within your application and other events happening within AWS. The third tenet is stateless. That, in my experience, is the hardest that developers, especially developers, struggle with. Because if you come from a data center perspective and you work with legacy applications, you probably wondering where does the state of the application stored? Because the server was an atomic, unit of compute for you. Now the server is gone. We manage that for you. So, but that is again, we see a lot of customers, one obvious option is choose DynamoDB to store the state of the application, or use Elasticcache to store the state of the applications. So there are different ways you can do that in serverless. We always encourage stateless applications and asynchronous invocations for serverless modern applications, and that is really the key to scaling effectively. The fourth tenet is start thinking about your database early in the process, very early. Start thinking about how the data is flowing within your application. What type of data is it? Is it structured data? Is it semi-structured data? Is it non-structured data, videos, files, bitmaps, things like that? So because making decisions early on the database is going to inform other decisions, other parts of your architecture, if you will. And chances in modern serverless application, you most likely going to be using more than one data store. So don't count on just using just a relational database. Chance you're going to be using a relational database, a NoSQL database, maybe even time series database, depending on the workload. The last tenet is don't reinvent the wheel, meaning use our service. We have a host of managed services for you in the serverless space. And I'll show you some of my examples that you can use those. Don't create your own serverless service. I was put in EC2. Will it work? Yes, it would. But you will lose all the benefits of running AWS serverless services, the agility, the scalability, and so on. So as Giovanni probably mentioned that I'm going to get a bit deeper into is how would you assess your workload for modernization? Let's say you're looking at a whole portfolio at your company that has like 10, 15, hundreds workload. We have customers that are running hundreds or thousands of applications basically. So how do you start modernizing? The first step in your assessment should be identify the first 2 to 3 applications that you want to modernize, and you have all kinds of applications. So my advice to you is I work with so many customers, and one thing I've seen consistent is that successful approach is tiering your application, right? So start tiering the application. For example, tier 1 would be the most critical, business critical applications, right? Um, so tier 1 will be the most critical applications. Those are the type of applications. If that application goes down, your entire business goes down, basically, right? And it affects, will have a negative effect in your reputation of your company. But there are also other applications, like in the lower right corner. If those applications go down for like 1 or 2 hours, it's not the end of the world, right? So things like employee portal or benefits application and so on. So start with the one that you can ready to modernize, so your team can get the experience. Okay, if you don't have much experience with cloud deployments, and leave those modernized in the long term. Those in phases as well. And of course, there'll be application that you can do in the short term. So start categorizing those applications. That's the first thing I would do. Okay. The second thing is once you identify the application, understand very well that application very well. That's a really a crucial step in the assessment phase of modernization. You can certainly do a lot of things. Like for example, you can load test the application for performance. You can look at the application configuration data, figure out which external libraries does it use, what integration touch point does it have externally. Was maybe it integrates with SAP or PeopleSoft or some other external SaaS application. Do a static code analysis, do a runtime code analysis, and most important in my mind, talk to the owner of the application. That's the institutional knowledge that you will gain our gold when you talk to the application owner. He's going to be able to tell you what software vulnerabilities the application have, what programming language they use, what they use for the CI/CD pipeline, if applicable, what frameworks they use like Vue or React and so on. And the whole idea of understanding the application very well is going to make your life a lot easier when you start modernize. Because once you do that, you will have a very solid understanding of the current state architecture. Then you can start mapping those, right? Those components or services to the target state architecture.
So,
Now let's talk a
Hamdi,
little.
just real quickly.
Sure.
So I'm sure you've done a lot of these assessments. What are the things that normally trip up these assessments, especially when you're dealing with modernization based assessments?
That's a great question, Mike. So there are several things actually I've seen that tend to trip customers. And the first one is the awareness of the valid options. What I mean by that is typically in modernization projects, you have a lot of options around compute, storage, networking, and databases, right? So that you need to be aware of what those options are. And you can only do that by understanding your current application portfolio and what specific service that makes up the portfolio. That's understanding your application in the previous slide. And then mapping those to their counterpart. For example, in community, we have services like Lambda, but we also have other services as well, like EC2, Elastic Beanstalk. So understand what all those options are, what the pros and cons. The second thing that I see customers trip at is when you talk about enabling data persistence, especially for microservices application. So when you try to try on a data store for your application, any kind of company usually they have a variety of different data store technologies, right, and different types of data. So there'll still be a large amount of relational database customers still have, but increasingly we see the customer trying to manipulate and figure data using things like NoSQL database or MongoDB or DynamoDB and so on. You might have Mike, a limited time to make decisions, right? So when you modernize, sometimes management wants you to do in a certain time frame. That's when we try what I coin is try fast and fail fast strategy, meaning do a many POC on the application just to see what's the viability of modernizing that application. There is also a very important part during the assessment, and make sure that you have the domain knowledge, meaning that your staff is actually does understand most, at least at a good level, the kind of technology that you're going to use to modernize the application. If not, then you might have to consider creating an enablement plan and so on. But a key component here is creating what we call CCOE. That is a must take step before any modernization project, and that's going to live with you for a very long time. That's Cloud Center of Excellence, and there's a team of specialized members of your company and that come from different disciplines. It would include people like solution architects, enterprise architects, DevOps engineers, or InfoSec people, corporate security people, and so on. And try to pick those people that are technically savvy and also well respected within your organization, because that will make it easier for the buy-in for your modernization project down the road. So those are the things I can think of, Mike, that usually trip customers during the assessment phase.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. Thank you for that, Andy.
Of course, of course. Now we just talk a little bit about the modernized space. So you already did touch a little bit about the legacy application. I'm just gonna just set the stage for a modern application. So this is what we know, right? Monolithic applications are very tightly coupled. It has several layers, three or more layers, and the all presentation layer, logic layer, and so on are all tied down to the database. And that causes a problem when you make a change. When you make a change into one of the layers, you need to make changes to other layers as well. And using monolithic applications or architectures, they use a single pipeline, release pipeline, if you will, and that will cause long deployment process, and you have to check with everyone on the team. You have to notify everybody you're making change and so on. So it's really hard to iterate and develop fast or respond to market changes, if you will, from a business perspective. Now compare that with microservices approach. So microservices are completely independent services that you develop, and you will see an example of that coming up soon. That they can be built independently, they can fail independently, they can be deployed independently, and that is really makes them reusable measure of codes that extend your business capabilities as well as your domain logic. So you can optimize them as well independently as well, and they make great fit for modern application development. Let's look quickly at some of the patterns. I only picked one pattern followed by an example. This is like the most popular pattern I've seen in microservices. I don't know if you guys know Martin Fowler. He's a very well established software architect, and he was actually in Australia rainforest in 2004, and he noticed those strangle fig trees. They seed on the top of branches of the trees, and they work their way down and they root in the ground, and they keep growing and growing over time, and they take on those spectacular shapes, but until they actually strangle the tree that was once their host. Hence the name of the strangle pattern. So Martin came up with the idea that he can actually do the same with software. So let's see an example of that. Well, to employ the strangle pattern, which a lot of our customers actually employ, is you start creating a new system around the edges. So you have here a monolithic application running on DB and a browser, very straightforward, but it's all tightly coupled. So you start, instead of trying to do a big bang, because as the saying goes, if you try to do a big bang in modernization, a big bang is all what you get, right? That makes sense. Um, so instead of doing a big bang, start building a system around the edges. So start introducing, for example, a proxy component between the browser and the monolithic application, so you can route traffic, right? And then you're gonna start next. You're gonna start extracting. The extraction phase start extracting uh, functionality of the monolithic application one at a time, and develop those as microservices, right? And each one is going to own its own data and its own database, and keep repeating the process. Basically, keep extracting the monolith functionality into its own microservices, and over time, you will actually choke or strangle the monolithic application will be gone. But for sometimes you will both exist together. So that's a triangle pattern. Now I'd like to give you an API-driven design example, but I would like to do that in the sense or terms of our well-architected framework. If you guys have not heard about the AWS well-architected framework, I will 100% strongly encourage you to read the white paper. Just Google AWS well-architected framework. It's white paper. It's kind of long, maybe an hour to read, but it's worth it. What the framework is basically it's a tribal knowledge that AWS solution architects collected or compiled over a decade ago. It was done by our ProServe team, and it comprises of all those pillars you're looking at. So we learn every single best practice. We learn from our hands-on experience with the customer and helping them build application on AWS is consolidated in that well-architected framework, right? Things like operational excellence, for example, infrastructure as code, right? Auto run books, security. We believe in security in depth at all layers, reliability, that your application needs to run even in the case of failure. So think about things like failover, right? DR, performance efficiency. You can, like Mike said earlier, you can go global, right? Uh, or you can define a regional API and so on. Cost optimization, use our things like AWS budget or AWS Cost Explorer. Sustainability, that's that's our newest pillar. We just added that actually a few couple of months ago, and that one is reduce the carbon footprint. Two servers running at a utilization of 30% is not as efficient as one server running at 60% because of the energy requirement for per each server. So now let's look at an example to hopefully put it in perspective. And again, I'll look at the example with you guys, uh, based on that well-architected framework. This way, you learn how to use that framework in order to create a production-ready application. So this happens to be a serverless example, obviously, and the application consists of three different services: API gateway, which is our serverless services. Also, our serverless service, by the way. API Gateway is a fully managed service, allows you to create, build, version, update APIs. And that's the entry point to this example application. Lambda is our function as a service. It runs your code on demand. And Lambda, that's where your business logic would live. And then it processes the logic with the event coming in, and it will persist the data in a DynamoDB database. So from an operational standpoint, if you look at the operational pillar, I need to include some of the best practices here based on the framework. The first thing I would do, for example, I would enable standard logging, right? Using Amazon CloudWatch, logs and metrics. I will also enable X-Ray. X-Ray is a great serverless service for, especially for microservices application, and it allows you to do a whole end-to-end request response tracing. So if anything goes wrong with your HTTP call, for example, or API call for request or response, it will be recorded in the service map in X-Ray. Next is reliability. From a reliability standpoint, I will introduce the API gateway because that's your entry point to the application. I will regulate inbound access rates. So for example, I'll say, well, a given client or a given tenant can only send 100 requests per second, or 100 API requests per second with 50 bursts, right? And that will help you first reduce cost, obviously. Second, it will also help you protect you against bad actors, right? Because some if you don't do rate access limits, then you can be flooded with HTTP requests or server, or even worse, server DDoS attack. From a security perspective, we can add to this architecture to make more protection like Amazon Cognito. Cognito is our AWS user management. It's also serverless, and it integrates with a lot of like social networks like Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. It integrates with things like Microsoft Active Directory, which is very common in most IT shops. So you can do that, and you can also authorize access using Cognito authorizers, which API Gateway supports, but you can also use JWT authorization, and you can use custom authorizers as well. Let's say also you have a need to keep track of passwords and ID to access database. That's when you can use AWS Secret Manager to retrieve those securely at runtime. Next, performance. Couple of things in performance. For example, if you're running for API Gateway, maybe, and all your customers going to be in the East Coast in New York, maybe you should you enable or define the regional endpoint type API that will help you with performance, or if you know your customer is going to be global, then use the edge style API and API gateway that under the cover will deploy a CDN, content delivery network, for you, that will cache your content at the edge of our network. Another thing you can do from a performance standpoint is you can use on-demand billing for your database, right? Until you have a good feeling on what's really the read or write requests are, then you can switch to a provision throughput where you specify exactly what the throughput is going to be like. From a cost perspective, you always have to balance cost performance. That's always a trade-off, right? In architecture. And Lambda being the business logic layer, that'd be a good place to do the tuning, because that's the one that processes the events. And for that, we have a tool called Lambda Power Tuning. This is just Google Lambda Power Tuning. You have it in GitHub, and that will give you some really good tips on how to do that. Lastly, I would like to leave you with just a couple of best practices when it comes to serverless. Obviously, use the well-architected framework, right? That's going to give you the strong foundation. It's going to allow you to build in all those pillars as you go, versus retrofitting them. Automation is key, right? So use automation. We have lots of automation tools you can use. We have CloudFormation, that's our infrastructure as code. We have what we call SAM, Serverless Application Model, which a cell layer that runs on top of CloudFormation allows you to do serverless applications. Leverage our managed services wherever possible. Managed services, you don't have to worry about scaling, fault tolerance, all this built in for you, including a lot of security best practices. As I mentioned before, our cloud works on X-ray. Develop the system best practices and how you're going to monitor your application. It's not enough you modernize the application and you run it in AWS, newly microservice application. You need to know what's happening inside your application. That gives you insights, also going to help you with troubleshooting the application when things go wrong. And like Giovanni said before, don't boil the ocean, minimize the scope creep. So in serverless, always make small changes, reversible changes, and incremental changes. And here's some resources for you. I will definitely start with the well-architected framework, and then I will go with the modernization strategy guide, AWS perspective guidance, second to last link, and then you can look at the other links as well. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure. Back to you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Hamdi. That was really good information. So we just have a couple of minutes before the end of our time. So we don't really have a lot of opportunity to take questions, unfortunately, but I do encourage you, if you do have questions, to reach out to us, either to those of us here on the webinar, so myself or Giovanni or Hamdi, or you can probably find us on LinkedIn, or you can reach out to Accelerate through the website, and we'd be happy to answer these questions for you.
Sure.
I think with that, I mean, I don't see any questions, and we really don't have enough time for them. So I'm going to wrap it up at this point. I want to thank you, Giovanni, and you, Hamdi, for joining us on this, providing all this great information. I know it takes a lot of time and effort to pull these things together, and I think this was really great. So I appreciate your effort there.
Absolutely, and Mike, please feel free to put for everyone my email address is the chat, my Amazon email address. If you want to reach out to me, that's fine too. So please give us the option.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and we can send that out. I think marketing generally sends out a note saying, we've made this available online, and we can share some information there on how to contact us. I think that would be the best, most efficient.
I definitely do that, Mike.
Yeah, and so finally, I'd like to thank the audience for joining. We do this for you. If you didn't come, then there would be not a lot of point. And so we hope you got a lot out of it. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.